Ad hominem fallacy. Have you ever been in a discussion and felt something was off, as if they were not really talking about what you said? Or maybe you have seen a debate and thought, wait, that does not make sense. Well, you are not alone. What perhaps you have detected is a subtlety called ad hominem. It sounds sophisticated, right? Actually, it is not. It is just an elegant way of saying that someone is attacking you instead of your argument. Let's analyze it. Imagine that you are talking about why you think a new local park is a great idea. You have data, figures, maybe even drawings. Then, instead of saying, I do not agree because the cost is too high, someone says, well, you only say that because you're an environmentalist hippie who does not understand the problems of the real world. Do you see what happened? They have overlooked your argument and gone directly for you. That is ad hominem. It is like this. You're trying to build a house with logic, and someone comes and throws mud at the builder. They do not attack the house, only the person who builds it. And that is the objective. It is a distraction. It pretends to put you on the defensive, diverting your attention from the real issue. It is a way to win a discussion without really winning it. It is a low blow. Now, there are different types of ad hominem. Some are very obvious, like insulting someone. Others are a little more subtle. Maybe they bring up something irrelevant from your past, question your intelligence, or point out some personal defect. The goal is always the same, to make you look bad so that your argument looks bad too. Why do people do this? Well, sometimes it is because they do not have a good counterargument. They are cornered, so they resort to personal attacks. Other times, it is just a way to divert attention. If they manage to anger or make you nervous, they can control the conversation. And sometimes, let's be honest, it is simply mean. But here is the key. Ad hominem attacks do not prove anything. The fact that someone calls you names does not mean that your argument is incorrect. It only means that they are not playing fair. So how do you deal with it? The best thing is, of course, to politely call attention to it. Say something like, I understand that you are upset, but attacking me personally does not address my argument. Can we stick to facts? I am not interested in personal attacks. Let's focus on the issue at hand. Do not let yourself be dragged into an insult match. That is just what they want. Keep calm, concentrate, and take the conversation back to the real issue. And if they keep insisting, you can always leave. You do not have to waste time with people who are not willing to maintain a respectful discussion. Recognizing ad hominem attacks is a superpower. It helps you see beyond appearances and allows you to maintain more productive conversations. It is a tool that helps you detect when someone tries to manipulate you. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And believe me, you will start to see it everywhere, in politics, in debates, even in everyday conversations. So next time someone tries to attack you instead of your arguments, remember this. They are not winning here. They are only showing that they have nothing better to say. And you, my friend, are too intelligent to fall for it. The straw man fallacy. Imagine you're talking about healthy eating. You say, I think we should eat more vegetables. And someone responds, so, you're saying we should all become rabbits and eat only lettuce? Wait a moment, please. That is not what you said, is it? You have just found a classic straw man argument. It is like this. Instead of refuting your real argument, they have built a false and weaker version of it, a straw man, and they attack it. It is easier to knock down a straw man than a real person, right? That is the key point. They try to make your argument seem ridiculous, so they can dismiss it without addressing the real issues. Suppose you defend stricter regulation of industrial pollution. You're concerned about the impact on the environment and on public health. Someone could respond, so, you want to close all factories and destroy the economy? You want everyone to lose their jobs. Again, that is not what you said. You're not suggesting all factories be closed, only that they reduce pollution. But by misrepresenting your words, they created an easy straw man. Why does this happen here? Sometimes it is intentional, of course. It is a deceptive tactic that is used to win discussions without having to address the real arguments of the other person. Other times, it may be unintentional too. People may misunderstand or misrepresent your argument without even realizing that. But whether intentional or not, the result is still the same. Your real argument is ignored, and in its place, a weaker, distorted version appears. The straw man fallacy often relies on exaggeration and oversimplification. They take your argument out of context, making it seem extreme or ridiculous. They can also take your words out of context, focusing on a single phrase or expression, and ignore the rest of your argument. It is like taking a single brick from a building and saying the whole building is defective. So, how can you defend against a straw man? The first step is recognizing it. Pay attention to how your argument is represented. If it does not sound like what you said, you are probably dealing with a straw man. The next step is to call it out. In a polite way, naturally. Say something like, "That is not what I said at all. I'm not suggesting we all become rabbits. I'm suggesting we eat more vegetables." Or, "I think you're misrepresenting my argument here. I am not advocating closing all factories to stricter regulations on pollution." Do not let them get away with misrepresenting what you say. Stand firm and bring the conversation back to your real argument. You may also want to clarify your position, explaining what you really mean and do not. By clearly expressing your position, you make it harder for them to build you a straw man. It is important to remember that straw man arguments are a sign of poor reasoning. If someone has to resort to misrepresenting your argument, it means they lack a solid counterargument. By recognizing and pointing out straw man fallacies, you can have more honest and productive conversations. You can make sure that your real arguments are heard and addressed instead of being replaced by a distorted version. And in doing so, you contribute to a more logical and respectful dialogue. Slippery slope fallacy. Okay, imagine this. You're worried about the increase in gasoline prices. Someone says, "If we let the price of gasoline go up now, the next thing will be going to work on horseback. Then no one will be able to afford food and society will collapse." Hey, wait a moment. How do we go from gasoline prices to societal collapse? That, my friends, is a classic slippery slope fallacy. It's like this. Someone argues that if we take one small step, a chain of disastrous consequences will occur. Basically, they're saying that if A happens, then B will happen, then C, then D, and so on until Z, which is terrible. They skip all the intermediate logical steps, assuming that each step automatically leads to the next one. Let's analyze this with another example. Let's imagine a debate on school uniforms. Someone argues, if we allow students to wear school uniforms, they will lose individuality. Then they will become mindless robots, and, in the end, we will have a totalitarian state. Do you see how they have gone from uniforms to totalitarianism? They have not explained how or why one thing leads to another. They have simply assumed that it will happen. The slippery slope fallacy is often used to create alarm and fear. It makes it seem that even small changes will have catastrophic results. It is a way to shut down debate and prevent any change from occurring. It is a tool that amplifies potential negative results while ignoring potential positive ones. Why is this fallacy used? Sometimes it stems from a genuine fear of the unknown. They may be concerned about the unintended consequences of decisions. Other times, it is a deliberate attempt to manipulate people. By exaggerating the potential risks, they can make their opponents seem reckless or irrational. The problem with the slippery slope is that it ignores real-world complexity. It assumes that events are predetermined and that there is no way to stop the chain reaction once started. But, in reality, many factors can influence the outcome of a decision. Just because one thing happens does not mean that everything else will happen. So, how do you recognize a slippery slope argument? Look for arguments that go from one extreme to another without any logical connection. Pay attention to words like inevitably, automatically, and always. These words often indicate that someone is using a slippery slope argument. If you detect a slippery slope, point it out. Politely, of course, and say something like, "I understand your concern, but I don't see how allowing school uniforms will lead to a totalitarian state. Can you explain the intermediate steps?" Or, "I think you are exaggerating the possible consequences. We have to take into account the evidence, not just the worst-case scenario." Don't let anyone scare you with exaggerated predictions. By questioning slippery slope arguments, you will be able to have more productive and rational conversations. You will be able to focus on the real evidence and the actual consequences of a decision. Remember that just because one thing can happen does not mean that everything else will happen. When learning to identify and address slippery slope fallacies, you will be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being manipulated by fear. You can help create a more balanced and reasonable dialogue where real risks and benefits are carefully weighed. The no true Scotsman fallacy. The true fans would agree, or no true believer would say that. Have you ever heard claims like this? They are designed to close debate, not encourage it. It is a clever trick, the no true Scotsman fallacy. It is like this. Someone makes a general claim and, when faced with contradictory evidence, changes the rules of the game, excluding those who do not fit in the claim. In essence, it says that if you do not agree, you are not a genuine member of the group. But the fact that someone does not agree does not mean they are not part of the group. Let's analyze this. Imagine someone says, all Scots love haggis. Then you point out that your Scottish friend does not like haggis. The person could respond, but no true Scotsman dislikes haggis. Do you see what happened? They have changed the rules of the game to exclude your friend, instead of admitting their initial claim was too broad. Another example, someone claims, all true Christians oppose abortion. When presented with Christians who support abortion rights, they could say, well, those are not true Christians. Once again, they redefine the group to exclude those who contradict their claim. Why do people use the no true Scotsman fallacy? Sometimes it is a way to shield their beliefs from criticism. When faced with evidence that challenges their worldview, they can try to dismiss it by redefining the terms. Other times, it is a way to create an in-group and an out-group. By defining who is a true member of the group, they can exclude those who do not fit into their mold. And sometimes it is a way to avoid admitting they were wrong. The problem with the no true Scotsman fallacy is that it makes it impossible to have meaningful discussion. It creates a circular argument where any counterargument can be dismissed simply by redefining the group. It is a way to avoid facing facts. So, how do you detect the no true Scotsman fallacy? Look for arguments that redefine a group to exclude those contradicting the claim. Pay attention to arguments that use expressions like true or real. Ask yourself if the group's definition is being changed arbitrarily to fit the argument. If you detect the no true Scotsman fallacy, point it out. With education, of course. Say something like, I understand you believe all Scots love haggis, but redefining what a genuine Scotsman is does not change the fact that some Scots do not like it. Or, I understand that you believe that all authentic Christians are against abortion, but redefining what an authentic Christian is does not change the fact that some Christians support the right to abortion. Do not let anyone manipulate you with arbitrary definitions. By questioning the no true Scotsman fallacy, you will be able to maintain more honest and productive conversations. You will be able to focus on real evidence and prevent them from diverting you with irrelevant definitions. Remember, the fact that someone redefines a group does not mean their argument is valid. By learning to identify and address the no true Scotsman fallacy, you'll be able to have more meaningful discussions and avoid being deceived by deceptive tactics. You can help create a more open and inclusive dialogue where claims are evaluated based on evidence, not arbitrary definitions. Fallacy of appeal to authority. Have you ever heard someone say, well, my doctor said it, so it must be true, or this celebrity uses it, so it must be good? We often rely on experts or famous people for guidance, but sometimes that trust can lead us astray. That is where the appeal to authority fallacy comes into play. It goes like this. Someone argues that a claim is true simply because an authority figure said it, without providing other evidence. In essence, it says, trust me, because this person said it. But just because someone is an expert in a field does not mean they are an expert in everything. Let's analyze this. Imagine that a celebrity promotes a product to lose weight. He could say, this product helped me lose weight, so it will also help you. But just because a celebrity is famous does not mean that he is an expert in medicine. They may be paid to promote the product or have used other ways to lose weight. Their experience does not have to be valid for everyone. Another example. A politician quotes a famous scientist to support their policy on climate change. But just because the scientist is an expert in physics does not mean he is an expert in climatology. His experience could be irrelevant to the subject at hand. Why do we turn to authority? Sometimes it's for convenience. It is easier to trust someone's opinion than to investigate on our own. Other times, it is a matter of trust. We tend to trust authority figures, especially if they are experts in their field. And sometimes it is a deliberate attempt to manipulate others. By invoking the name of a respected figure, people can make their claims seem more credible. The problem with the fallacy of appealing to authority is that it ignores the importance of evidence in critical thought. Just because someone is an authority does not mean they are always right. Even experts can make mistakes or have biases, and sometimes the authority figure may not be an expert in the relevant field. So how do you detect the fallacy of appealing to authority? Look for arguments that are based solely on the opinion of an authority. Ask yourself if the authority is truly an expert in the relevant field. Ask yourself if there is any evidence that supports the claim. If you detect the fallacy of appealing to authority, point out. Politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that your doctor has recommended this product, but I would like to see some scientific evidence to support their claim, or I understand that this scientist is an expert in physics, but I'm not sure that their experience is relevant to climate science. Don't let anyone convince you with empty recommendations. By questioning the fallacies of appealing to authority, you'll be able to maintain more informed and logical conversations. You will be able to focus on the real evidence and avoid being influenced by irrelevant opinions. Remember that even experts can be wrong. By learning to identify and address the fallacies of appealing to authority, you'll be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived by faulty reasoning. You will be able to contribute to creating a more logical and reasonable dialogue in which claims are based on evidence, and not just on the opinions of authority figures. Fallacy of division. If the whole is bad, each part must also be bad. Or, because the cake is bad, these ingredients must be bad. Sounds like the opposite of the previous one, right? And it is. This is the division fallacy. However, it is as misleading as its opposite. It is like this. Someone assumes that since something is true for the whole, it must be true for all parts. Basically, they're saying that what is true for the whole must be true for the individual parts. But just because something is true for the whole does not mean that it is true for each part. Let's analyze this. Let's imagine a company known for manufacturing unreliable products. Someone could argue that this company manufactures unreliable products, so this particular product must be unreliable. But that is not necessarily true. The company could have some good products among its otherwise poor offerings. The general reputation does not guarantee the quality of each individual item. Another example, someone states, this team is terrible, so this player on the team must be terrible. But the overall performance of the team does not necessarily reflect each player's individual skill. There may be talented players on a bad team. Why do we fall into the division fallacy? Sometimes it is an oversimplification. We tend to generalize from the whole to the parts without accounting for individual variations. Other times it is a bias. We can let our negative opinions about the whole influence our perception of the parts. And sometimes it is a way of making general claims without accounting for individual cases. The problem with the fallacy of division is that it ignores the importance of individual differences. Not all parts of a whole are the same. It can lead to unfair judgments and inaccurate conclusions. It assumes uniformity where none exists. So how do you detect a fallacy of division? Look for arguments that assume that the properties of the whole are automatically true of the parts. Pay attention to arguments that ignore individual variations. Ask yourself if the properties of the parts are necessarily the same as the properties of the whole. If you detect a fallacy of division, point it out. With education, of course. Say something like, I understand that this company is known for its unreliable products, but that doesn't mean that this particular product is unreliable. We have to evaluate it independently. Or, I understand that this team is terrible, but that doesn't mean that this player is terrible. We have to take into account their individual skills. Don't let anyone convince you with faulty generalizations. By questioning the fallacies of division, You will be able to have more accurate and fair discussions. You will be able to focus on the individual parts and avoid being deceived by general assumptions. Remember that the whole is not always representative of its parts. By learning to identify and address the fallacies of division, you will be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived by faulty assumptions. You can help create a more nuanced and accurate understanding of systems where individual variations are taken into account. Appeal to the fallacy of achievement. Look at everything I've done, so I must be right. Or, I have achieved this, so you should listen to me. Have you ever felt that someone's achievements are used to shut down a debate? That is the appeal to achievement, a deceptive way to claim authority without addressing the actual argument. It is like this. Someone uses their past achievements to claim that their current argument is correct, regardless of its merit. In essence, they are saying, I have done great things, so I must be right now. But past achievements do not automatically validate a person's current opinions. Let's analyze it. Imagine a famous athlete discussing complex economic policies. Someone using the appeal to achievement might say, I have won several championships, so I know what I'm talking about. Now, being a successful athlete requires discipline and skill, but that doesn't make someone an economics expert. They're using their sporting achievements to claim authority in a field that has nothing to do with it. Another example, someone who has achieved great success in business discusses social issues. Someone who resorts to achievement might say, I have created a successful company, so my opinions on society are correct. Again, creating a successful company requires business acumen, but that doesn't make someone an expert on social issues. They're using their business achievements to claim authority in an area that has nothing to do with it. Why is the appeal to achievement used? Sometimes it is a way to avoid providing actual evidence. By relying on their past achievements, they can make their opinions seem automatically valid. Other times, it is a way to affirm dominance and claim superior knowledge. And sometimes it is a way to create an aura of experience without really having any. The problem with the appeal to achievement is that it ignores the importance of evaluating arguments on their own merits. It can lead to accepting false claims based on irrelevant achievements. It creates a false sense of experience and closes off dialogue. It avoids addressing the real problem. So, how do you detect the appeal to achievement? Look for arguments that are based on past achievements to claim authority in unrelated areas. Pay attention to arguments that avoid the real issue. Ask if the person's achievements are relevant to their argument. If you detect an appeal to achievements, point this out. Politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that you are a successful athlete, but that does not make you an expert in economics. Let's talk about economic policies. Or, I understand that you have built a successful company, but that does not make your opinions on social issues automatically correct. Let's talk about social issues. Don't let someone convince you with irrelevant achievements. By questioning appeals to achievements, you will be able to maintain more informed and focused debates. You will be able to prioritize the evaluation of arguments on their own merits and avoid being deceived by irrelevant claims of authority. Remember that past achievements do not automatically validate someone's opinions. By learning to identify and address appeals to achievement, you can make more informed decisions and avoid deception by erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more honest and focused dialogue in which arguments are evaluated on their own merits, not on the irrelevant achievements of the person making them. The sunk cost fallacy. But we have already invested so much, so we cannot stop now after all this effort. Have you ever felt trapped by a bad decision due to investments? That is the sunk cost fallacy, a deceptive way to justify continuing something just because you have already invested time, money, or effort. It is like this. Someone argues that since they have already invested resources in something, they must continue to invest, even if no longer beneficial. In essence, he is saying, we cannot waste what we invested. But past investments have nothing to do with decisions. Let's analyze this. Imagine someone buys tickets for a concert, but gets sick. Someone using the sunk cost fallacy might say, I've already paid for the tickets, so I have to go. Even if I feel terrible, I have already spent money. Going to the concert will not give back the money and could worsen things. The past investment should not dictate the decision. Another example, someone starts a business that loses money. Someone using the sunk cost fallacy might say, "We have invested so much time and money that we cannot give up now, but continuing to invest in a failing business will not make it thrive. It could simply cause more losses." The past investment should not dictate business strategy. Why is the sunk cost fallacy used? Sometimes, it is a way to avoid admitting that a mistake was made. By continuing to invest, you can pretend that you're still right. Other times, it is a way to justify actions to other people. By claiming that resources are not wasted, criticism is avoided. And sometimes it helps deal with the emotional stress of loss. The problem with the sunk cost fallacy is that it ignores the importance of making rational decisions based on current circumstances. It can lead to wasting resources on failed projects. It creates a false sense of obligation, preventing us from cutting our losses. Avoid the need to consider any real benefits. So, how can a sunk cost fallacy be detected? Look for arguments justifying continuing something based on past investments. Pay attention to arguments ignoring current benefits and costs. Ask yourself whether past investments are relevant now. If you spot a sunk cost fallacy, point it out politely, of course. Say something like, "I understand that you paid for the tickets, but going to the concert will not give you the money back. Let's focus on whether staying at home will feel better." Or, "I understand that you invested time and money in the business, but continuing to invest could mean more losses. Let's focus on whether the business remains viable." Don't let anyone convince you with irrelevant past investments. By questioning the sunk cost fallacies, you will be able to maintain more rational and grounded discussions. You can prioritize decision-making based on current circumstances and prevent past investments from derailing you. Remember, past investments are irrelevant to current decisions. By learning to identify and address sunk cost fallacies, you can make more informed decisions and prevent flawed reasoning from derailing you. It can help create a more rational and effective dialogue in which decisions are made based on current benefits and costs, and not only on past investments, affirming a disjunctive fallacy. Either this is true, or that is true, or one of these things must be true. Have you ever felt forced to choose between two options when more exist? That is affirming a disjunction, deceptively creating a false dilemma. It is like this. Someone presents two options as mutually exclusive and then affirms that, since one is true, the other must be false. Basically, it is saying that it is this or that. It is this, so not that. But the fact that one option is true does not mean the other is false. Let's analyze this. Imagine someone tells you that you're either a good person or you are a bad person. You are a good person. Therefore, you are not a bad one. Now, it is true that being a good person is a positive thing, but that does not mean that someone cannot have flaws or make mistakes. The two options aren't mutually exclusive. Another example, someone argues that the light is either on or off. The light is on, so it's not off. In a simple situation with an on and off switch, this is indeed true. What if there's a dimmer? What if the light flickers? What if there are fluctuations in the electrical supply? Do the options presented exclude other possibilities? Why do people use disjunctive claims? Sometimes it's a way to simplify complex situations. By presenting only two options, they can make the choice seem easier. Other times, it's a way to manipulate the conversation. By forcing a false dilemma, they can direct the discussion as desired. And sometimes it's a way to create a false sense of certainty. The problem with affirming a disjunction is that it ignores the importance of considering all the possibilities. It can lead to inaccurate conclusions and poor decisions. It creates a false sense of certainty and closes off meaningful dialogue, avoids the need to consider all evidence. So, how can affirming a disjunction be detected? Look for arguments presenting only two options and then affirming that, since one is true, the other must be false. Pay attention to arguments that ignore the possibility of other options. Ask yourself if the two options are truly mutually exclusive. If you spot a disjunctive claim, point it out politely, of course. Say something like, "I understand that you're presenting two options, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive. You could be a good person and still make mistakes." Or, I understand that you're saying that the light is on or off, but there could be other possibilities, such as a dimmer or a fluctuation in the electrical supply. Do not let anyone convince you with false dilemmas. By questioning and affirming disjunctive fallacies, you can have more informed and exhaustive discussions. You will be able to prioritize all possibilities and prevent being deceived with limited options. Remember that just because one option is true does not mean the other is automatically false. By learning to identify and address affirmative disjunctive fallacies, you can make better decisions and avoid being deceived by erroneous reasoning. You will be able to contribute to a more complete and nuanced dialogue in which all possibilities are taken into account, not just those presented. Fallacy of appealing to emotion. Have you ever been influenced by an advertisement that reached your heart or a political speech that moved you? We all have emotions, and these play an important role in our decisions. But sometimes those emotions can be used to manipulate us all. That is where the appeal to emotion fallacy comes into play. It is like this. Someone tries to convince you of something by playing with your feelings instead of using logic or evidence. Basically, they're telling you, believe me because it seems good or because it makes you feel something, but the fact that something makes you feel a certain way does not mean it is true. Let's analyze this. Imagine a charitable advertisement that shows heartbreaking images of hungry children. It may make you feel sad and want to donate, but the fact that you feel sad does not mean that the charitable organization is effective or that your donation is going to be used wisely. The advertisement appeals to your emotions. It does not provide evidence of the charitable organization's impact. Another example, a politician gives a passionate speech about patriotism and national pride. It may make you feel proud to be a citizen, but the fact that you feel proud does not mean that their policies are correct. They are appealing to your emotions, not addressing the real problems at all. Why do people appeal to emotions in arguments? Sometimes it is a way to distract attention from a lack of evidence. When someone's argument is weak, they may try to compensate by appealing to your feelings. Other times, it is a way to manipulate you directly. By playing with your emotions, they can circumvent your critical thinking and make you more likely to accept their claims. And sometimes they sincerely try to connect with you on an emotional level, but still do not provide logical arguments. The problem with the appeal to emotion fallacy is that it can lead to irrational decisions. Emotions are important, but they should not be the only basis for our beliefs alone. We must also take into account the facts and evidence too. Relying solely on emotions can make us vulnerable to manipulation and deception easily. So, how do you detect the appeal to emotion fallacy? Look for arguments that rely heavily on emotional language or images. Pay attention to arguments that try to evoke strong feelings, such as fear, anger, or pity. Ask yourself if the argument offers any logical support for its claims at all. If you detect an appeal to emotion fallacy, point it out politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that these images are heartbreaking, but I would like to see some evidence of how the charitable organization uses donations, or I appreciate your passion for our country, but I would like to discuss the specific details of your policies. Do not let someone convince you with emotional manipulation by challenging appeals to emotion fallacies. You can have more rational and informed conversations then. You can focus on the real evidence and avoid being carried away by irrelevant feelings. Remember that emotions are important, but they should not replace logic and reason ever. By learning to identify and address the appeal to emotion fallacies, you can make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived by emotional appeals. You can help create a more balanced and reasonable dialogue in which claims are supported by evidence, not just feelings. Suppressed correlative fallacy explained. You cannot have one without the other, or they always go together. Have you ever felt that someone claims two things are inseparable without any real evidence? That is the suppressed correlative fallacy, a deceptive way of creating a false dependence. It works like this. Someone insinuates that two related terms are mutually dependent and that one cannot exist without the other, without providing any real evidence. Basically, they're saying that if you have this, you must have that, or you cannot have one without the other. But the fact that two things are related does not mean they are inseparable. Let's analyze it. Imagine someone says that there cannot be a winner without a loser. In a competitive game, there is usually a winner and a loser, but that does not mean that the concept of winning depends on the concept of losing. You can have a personal victory without another person necessarily having to lose. The correlation is artificially forced. Another example, someone argues that there cannot be light without darkness. Although light and darkness are related concepts, they are not mutually dependent in the sense implied by the statement. Light can exist without darkness, like the light of a star in the vast void of space. The correlative is unnecessarily restrictive. Why is the suppressed correlative used? Sometimes it is a way to simplify complex relationships. By claiming that two things are inseparable, you avoid having to explain the nuances of their connection. Other times, it is a way to create a false sense of necessity by implying that one thing depends on another. They can make their claim seem more convincing, and sometimes it is a way to manipulate the conversation by limiting the possibilities. The problem with the suppressed correlative is that it ignores the importance of considering independent existence. It can lead to inaccurate conclusions and bad decisions. It creates a false sense of dependence and closes meaningful dialogue, avoids the need to consider all the evidence. So, how do you detect a suppressed correlative? Look for arguments that imply that two related terms are mutually dependent. Pay attention to arguments that ignore the possibility of independent existence. Ask yourself if the two terms are really inseparable. If you detect a suppressed correlative, point it out. Politely. Of course, say something like, I understand that you say that there cannot be a winner without a loser, but I do not think they are mutually dependent. You can get a personal victory without another person losing. Or, I understand that you say that there cannot be light without darkness, but light can exist independently, like the light of a star in space. Do not let anyone convince you with false dependencies. By questioning hidden correlative fallacies, you will be able to maintain more informed and complete debates. You will be able to prioritize independent existence and avoid being deceived by limited relationships. Remember, the fact that two things are related does not mean they are inseparable. By learning to identify and address hidden correlative fallacies, you will be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived by erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more complete and nuanced dialogue in which all possibilities are considered, not just those presented. Fallacy of the right to an opinion. I have the right to an opinion, or everyone has their own truth. Have you ever felt that someone uses their right to an opinion as a shield against any challenge? That is the fallacy of the right to an opinion, a deceptive way to avoid defending your points of view. It works like this. Someone claims that their opinion is immune to criticism simply because it is their opinion. In essence, they are saying, I can believe what I want, and you cannot say anything about it. But, although everyone has the right to an opinion, not all opinions are equally valid. Let's analyze it. Imagine someone says, I believe the earth is flat, and I have the right to an opinion. Now, although he has the right to believe it, that does not make it true. There is overwhelming scientific evidence that the earth is spherical. Simply expressing an opinion does not make it a fact. Another example, someone argues, I think vaccines cause autism, and I have a right to my opinion. Once again, you have the right to believe that. However, that belief is harmful because it contradicts scientific consensus and can lead to dangerous decisions. The phrase, I have a right to my opinion, does not exempt one from the responsibility of being well-informed. Why do people use the fallacy of a right to an opinion? Sometimes it is a way to avoid having to defend their beliefs by claiming that their opinion is untouchable. Thus, they avoid having to provide reasoning or evidence. Other times, it is a way of asserting intellectual superiority, implying that their opinion is above any criticism. They may feel more powerful. And sometimes it is a way to end a conversation without any real effort. The problem with the fallacy of, I have a right to my opinion, is that it confuses the right to have opinions with the validity of that opinion. It can lead to accepting false or harmful beliefs without critical evaluation. It creates a barrier to meaningful dialogue and prevents exchanging ideas. It avoids the need to face facts. So, How do you detect the fallacy of "I have a right to my opinion"? Look for arguments claiming that an opinion is immune from criticism. Pay attention to arguments that avoid providing reasoning or evidence. Ask yourself if the opinion is based on facts or just on personal feelings. If you detect the fallacy of "I have a right to my opinion," point it out politely, of course. Say something like, "I understand that you have that opinion, but that does not mean it's true. Let's see the evidence that supports or contradicts your belief." Or, "I understand that you have a right to your opinion, but that does not mean it is immune from criticism. Let's discuss the reasoning behind your belief." Do not let anyone convince you with empty claims of a right. By questioning the fallacy of "I have a right to my opinion," you will be able to maintain more productive and informed discussions. You can prioritize evaluating evidence-based beliefs and avoid being misled by irrelevant claims about rights. Remember, everyone has the right to their opinions, but not all opinions are equally valid. By learning to identify and address the fallacy of the right to an opinion, you can make more informed decisions and avoid being misled by erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more honest and evidence-based dialogue in which beliefs are evaluated based on facts and not just on personal feelings. Mistake. Is that a river bank or a place to put my money? Have you ever felt that someone was playing with words? That is where the fallacy of ambiguity sneaks. It is a trick in which a word or phrase with multiple meanings is used in a way that misleads or confuses. It is like that. Someone uses a word with two different meanings in a discussion, making it seem they're saying one thing when they are really saying another. Basically, they're changing the meaning of a word in the middle of a discussion to adapt it to their needs. Let's analyze this. Imagine that someone says that all banks are next to rivers. Therefore, the financial institution where I deposit my money is next to a river. Here, bank is used in two different senses, the bank of a river and a financial entity. By changing the meaning, the person creates a false connection. Another example, someone argues that the end of life is death and that the end of a sentence is death. Therefore, life is a sentence. Here, end is used in two different senses, the term of something and the final part of something. By confusing the meanings, the person creates a meaningless argument. Why is ambiguity used? Sometimes it is involuntary. They may not realize that they're using a word with multiple meanings. Other times, it is a deliberate attempt to deceive. When playing with language ambiguity, they can make their argument seem more convincing than it is. And sometimes it is a way to create a humorous or confusing effect. The problem with ambiguity is that it undermines clear communication. It creates confusion, which makes it difficult to understand the real argument. It can lead to false conclusions and misleading arguments. So, how do you detect a fallacy by ambiguity? Look for arguments that use words or phrases with multiple meanings. Pay attention to arguments that seem to change the meaning of a word in the middle of a sentence. Ask yourself if the word is used consistently throughout the argument. If you detect a fallacy by ambiguity, point it out. Politely, of course. Say something like, "I understand that you're saying that all banks are next to rivers, but you're using the word bank in two different senses. You are confusing the bank of a river with a financial bank." Or, "I understand that you are comparing the end of life with the end of a sentence, but you're using the word end in two different senses." Don't let anyone confuse you with word games. By questioning fallacies by ambiguity, you'll be able to maintain clearer and more precise discussions. You'll be able to focus on the real meaning of words and prevent ambiguity from misleading you. Remember that words have specific meanings and that these should not be changed during a discussion. By learning to identify and address fallacies by ambiguity, you'll be able to maintain more meaningful discussions and prevent misleading language from misleading you. You can help create a more precise and accurate dialogue in which words are used consistently and clearly. Etymological fallacy. The word means this, therefore it must be true. Have you ever tried to understand the current meaning of a word only by its origin? That is the etymological fallacy, a misleading way of claiming that a word's meaning has not changed. It is like that. Someone argues that a word's current meaning must be the same as its original meaning, ignoring how language evolves. Basically, they're saying that the word used to mean this, so it still means this. but words change in meaning over time. Let's analyze it. Imagine someone arguing that the word nice should mean ignorant because that is its original meaning. Now, it is true that nice originally meant ignorant, but over time, the meaning of the word has changed to pleasant or kind. The person is committing the etymological fallacy by ignoring this evolution. Another example, someone argues that the word horrible should mean full of wonder because that is its original meaning. Again, it is true that horrible originally meant full of wonder, but over time, the meaning of the word has changed to terrible or frightful. The person is committing the etymological fallacy by ignoring this evolution. Why is the etymological fallacy used? Sometimes it is a way to create a false sense of authority. By claiming to know the true meaning of a word, you can appear to have more knowledge. Other times, it is a way to manipulate language. By using an obsolete meaning, you can misrepresent the meaning of a statement. And sometimes it is a way to reinforce a belief based on an obsolete linguistic connection. The problem with the etymological fallacy is that it ignores the dynamic nature of language. It can lead to misunderstandings and misinterpretations. It creates a false sense of certainty and prevents meaningful communication. It avoids the need to take into account the current level of use. So, how do you detect the etymological fallacy? Look for arguments that claim that a word's current meaning must be the same as its original meaning. Pay attention to arguments that ignore how language evolves. Ask yourself whether the original meaning remains relevant today. If you spot the etymological fallacy, point it out politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that nice originally meant ignorant, but its current meaning is pleasant. Let's focus on the current meaning. Or, I understand that awful originally meant full of wonder, but its current meaning is terrible. Let's focus on the current meaning. Don't let anyone persuade you with obsolete meanings. By questioning the etymological fallacy, you can maintain more precise and documented debates. You will be able to prioritize understanding the current meaning of words and prevent irrelevant origins from confusing you. Remember that words' meanings change over time. By learning to identify and address the etymological fallacy, you'll be able to make more informed decisions and avoid deception by flawed reasoning. You can help create a more accurate and effective dialogue in which words are used according to their current meanings. Fallacy. Fallacy. You used a fallacy, so your entire argument is wrong. Sounds forceful, right? But wait a moment. The fact that someone uses a fallacy does not mean their conclusion is automatically false. That's where the fallacy comes in. It's like this. Someone assumes that since an argument contains a fallacy, the argument's conclusion must be erroneous. In essence, they're saying, you have made a mistake, so you are completely wrong. But the fact that an argument is wrong does not mean the conclusion is false. Let's analyze this. Imagine someone argues, everyone knows that aliens built the pyramids, so it must be true. This is a clear appeal to popularity fallacy. But the fact that the argument is wrong does not mean that aliens did not build the pyramids. It is still possible, though very unlikely, that aliens were involved. The fallacy does not automatically negate that possibility. Another example, someone argues, my grandfather smoked a pack a day and lived to be 90 years old, so smoking isn't that bad. This is a hasty generalization fallacy, but the fact that the argument is wrong does not mean that smoking is good for your health. Smoking is still harmful, even if someone has had an unusual experience. Why do people fall for the fallacy? Sometimes it is a way of closing the debate. By pointing out a fallacy, they can make it seem like they have won the discussion. Other times, it is a matter of oversimplification. They may assume that logical perfection is needed for a conclusion to be true. And sometimes it is a way to feel superior, as if they caught someone in a trap. The problem with the fallacy is that it ignores separating the argument from the conclusion. An argument may be wrong, but the conclusion can still be true. It can lead to discarding valid claims based on irrelevant errors. It makes people think in absolute terms, where things are perfectly correct or completely incorrect. So how do you spot a fallacy? Look for arguments that dismiss a conclusion solely because a fallacy was used. Pay attention to arguments that ignore the possibility of a conclusion being true despite a flawed argument. Ask yourself whether the conclusion could be true even if the argument is wrong. If you spot a fallacy, point it out. With education, of course. Say something like, I understand that the argument about aliens building the pyramids contains a fallacy, but that does not automatically mean that aliens were not involved. The possibility still exists, even if unlikely. Or rather, I understand that the argument about smoking contains a fallacy, but that does not mean that smoking is good for health. Smoking is still harmful. Do not let anyone convince you with flawed logic about flawed logic. By questioning the fallacies, you will be able to maintain more nuanced and precise debates. You will be able to focus on the real truth of the conclusion and prevent irrelevant errors from distracting you. Remember that an erroneous argument does not necessarily means that the conclusion is false. By learning to identify and address the fallacies of the fallacies, you can make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived by erroneous reasoning about erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more balanced and accurate dialogue in which conclusions are evaluated based on their own merits, not only on the defects of the arguments that support them. Fallacy of the false dilemma. Have you ever been told that you are either with us or against us? Or maybe that if you don't like this country, you should leave. These statements may seem strong, but they often hide a clever trick called the false dilemma. It is as if someone gave you only two options when, in reality, there are many more. Imagine you're deciding what to have for dinner. Someone tells you that you can choose between pizza and salad. But what if you fancy pasta or just a sandwich? Or maybe you're not hungry. The false dilemma, also known as a false dichotomy or black and white thinking, forces you to choose between two extremes, ignoring all other possibilities. This happens constantly in debates and discussions. Suppose someone is arguing about education. He could say, either we cut funding for public schools, or our children will never learn anything. But that is not true, is it? There are many other options, such as improving teacher training, investing in new resources, and changing the curriculum. By presenting only two options, they're trying to limit your thinking and push you towards their preferred choice. Think of it this way. It is as if someone showed you an image in which there are only colors black and white, when the world is full of vibrant colors. They are simplifying a complex issue, making it seem like there are only two sides when, in reality, there are many nuances. Why are false dilemmas used? Often, it is a way to manipulate you. By limiting your options, they can make their preferred option seem more appealing. It is a way to create a sense of urgency or fear, pushing you to make a quick decision without considering all of the facts. It is a tactic used to oversimplify complex issues. Sometimes it is not intentional. People may sincerely believe that there are only two options. They may be trapped in a rigid way of thinking, unable to see other possibilities. But, whether intentional or not, the false dilemma can lead to poor decisions. So, how do you detect a false dilemma? The key is to look for words like either, or, only, always, and never. These words often indicate that someone is trying to limit your options. Also, ask yourself if there are other possibilities. Is there an intermediate option? Are there alternative solutions? If you detect a false dilemma, point it out. Politely, of course. Say something like, I don't think those are the only two options. There are other possibilities that we should consider. Or rather, I understand that you're trying to simplify the problem, but I think we should consider all the options. Don't let anyone force you to make a false decision. By recognizing and questioning false dilemmas, you will be able to maintain more open and honest conversations. You will be able to explore all options and make more informed decisions. Remember that the world is not black and white. There are many shades of gray, and it is important to consider them all. By learning to see beyond false dilemmas, you can prevent yourself from being tricked into making decisions that do not suit you, and you can help others see the big picture. Genetic fallacy. You think something is bad because of its origin or creator. Have you ever heard this type of statement? They try to discredit an idea based on its origin, not its merit. That is the genetic fallacy, a deceptive way to dismiss something without addressing its content. It is like this: someone judges an idea based on its origin instead of validity. Basically, they're saying that it is bad because of its provenance. But the origin of an idea does not make it automatically true or false. Let's analyze this. Imagine that someone says a scientific study was financed by a large company, so it must be biased and erroneous. Now, it is true that funding sources can influence research, but that does not automatically invalidate the study's results. The study should be evaluated based on its methodology and tests, not only its funding. Another example, someone argues that a political ideology originated in a group of extremists, so it must be dangerous. But the fact that an ideology has a controversial origin does not mean all its ideas are intrinsically bad. The ideology must be judged by its specific principles and policies, not its history. Why do people resort to genetic fallacies? Sometimes it is a way to avoid facing opposing points of view. By dismissing an idea based on its origin, they avoid addressing its real arguments. Other times, it is a way to reinforce their prejudices. By associating an idea with a negative source, they can make it seem less attractive, and sometimes it is a way to create a shortcut to judge instead of really investigating. The problem with the genetic fallacy is that it ignores evaluating ideas on their own merits. It can lead to discarding valid claims based on irrelevant associations. It closes constructive dialogue and prevents us from considering different perspectives. So, how do you detect a genetic fallacy? Look for arguments that discredit an idea based on its source. Pay attention to arguments that ignore the idea's content itself. Ask yourself if the idea's source is really relevant to its validity. If you detect a genetic fallacy, point it out. In a polite way, of course. Say something like, I understand that the study was financed by a company, but let's focus on the methodology and tests of the study, not only its financing. Or, I understand that the ideology has a controversial origin, but let's evaluate its specific principles and policies. Do not let anyone convince you with irrelevant associations. By questioning genetic fallacies, you will maintain more informed and objective debates. You will be able to focus on the real content of ideas and prevent irrelevant origins from diverting you. Remember that the source of an idea does not determine its validity. By learning to identify and address genetic fallacies, you will make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived by erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more open and fair dialogue in which ideas are evaluated based on their own merits, not only their origin. Fallacy of appeal to ignorance. No one has proven that it is false, so it must be true. Or, since we do not know it, it is probably true. It is easy to fall into this type of logic, both you and others. That is the fallacy of ignorance. A deceptive way of claiming something is true simply because it has not been proven false. It is like this. Someone argues that a claim is true simply because it has not been proven to be false, or false simply because it has not been proven to be true. In essence, they are saying, we do not know it, so it must be that way. But the absence of proof is not proof of absence. Let's analyze this. Let's imagine someone saying, nobody has demonstrated that ghosts do not exist, so they must exist. Now then, it is certain that we have not demonstrated in a definitive way that ghosts do not exist, but that does not automatically mean that they exist. The lack of proof in any sense does not confirm anything. Another example, someone claims that given that scientists have not demonstrated that this supplement does not cure the common cold, it probably cures it. But the absence of proof against something does not mean that it is true. The burden of proof falls on the person that makes the claim, not on those who have not refuted it. Why is appeal to ignorance used? Sometimes it is a way to avoid providing proof. When someone's claim is weak, they could try to shift the burden of proof. Other times, it is a way of creating a false sense of certainty. By claiming that something is true because it has not been refuted, they can make their claim seem more credible. And sometimes it is a way of justifying beliefs based on a lack of understanding. The problem with the appeal to ignorance is that it ignores the importance of proof. It can lead to accepting claims without any real foundation. It is based on the absence of knowledge, which is not a reliable basis for truth. It creates a space for any affirmation to be considered, however far-fetched it may be, as long as it has not been refuted. So, how is an appeal to ignorance detected? Look for arguments that claim something is true because it has not been demonstrated that it is false. Pay attention to arguments that are based on the absence of proof. Ask yourself if the lack of proof really supports the claim. If you detect an appeal to ignorance, point it out. In an educated way, of course, say something like, I understand that nobody has demonstrated that ghosts do not exist, but that does not mean they exist. We need real proof that supports the claim. Or, I understand that scientists have not refuted the supplement, but that does not mean it cures the common cold. The burden of proof falls on the person that makes the claim. Do not let anyone convince you with empty claims. By questioning appeals to ignorance, you will be able to maintain more logical and well-founded discussions. You will be able to focus on real proof and avoid being deceived with irrelevant absences. Remember that the absence of proof is not proof of absence. By learning to identify and address appeals to ignorance, you will be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived with erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more logical and proof-based dialogue in which claims are supported by facts and not only by the lack of proof against. Fallacy of tone policing. You should not say that. Or the real problem here is your tone. Have you ever been criticized for how you say something instead of for what you say? That is tone policing, a deceptive way of distracting attention from the real topic. It is like this. Someone focuses on the tone of your message instead of its content to dismiss or invalidate your argument. In essence, it is saying, you are showing your feelings, therefore, you are wrong. But the way you say something does not change the fact that what you say is true. Let's analyze this. Imagine someone expressing their frustration about a social injustice. Someone tone policing could respond, you are being too emotional. If you were calmer, people would listen. They avoid addressing the real injustice and focus, instead, on the person's tone. They imply that the message is not valid because of how it is transmitted. Another example, someone criticizes a policy they consider harmful. Someone tone policing could respond, your language is too aggressive. You must be more respectful now. Again, they avoid discussing the merits of the policy and focus on the person's choice of words. They make it seem that the problem is the way of expressing oneself, rather than the message. Why is tone policing used? Sometimes it is a way to avoid difficult conversations. By focusing on tone, they avoid addressing difficult issues. Other times, it is a way to silence marginalized voices. By criticizing tone, they can make them feel their concerns are invalid. And sometimes it is a way to assert power and control. By dictating how someone should express themselves, they can maintain a sense of dominance. The problem with tone control is that it distracts attention from the real problems. It ignores the importance of addressing substantive concerns. It can silence important voices and prevent meaningful dialogue. It prioritizes courtesy over fighting against injustice. So, how can you detect tone policing? Look for arguments that focus on a message's tone rather than content. Pay attention to arguments that dismiss valid concerns based on how it is expressed. Ask yourself if the person is really addressing the issue. If you detect tone policing, point it out politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that my tone seems emotional to you, but let's focus on the real problem of social injustice. Or, I understand you think my language is aggressive, but let's talk about the harmful policy. Don't let anyone convince you with irrelevant criticisms about tone. By questioning tone, you will be able to maintain more productive and focused debates. You will be able to prioritize substantive concerns and avoid diversion with irrelevant criticisms. Remember that how you say something does not change the fact that it is true. By learning to identify and address tone control, you will be able to make more informed decisions and avoid deception by erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more honest, focused dialogue in which concerns are addressed rather than silenced. Fallacy of ambiguity that could mean anything at all, or you're just playing with words. Have you ever felt someone uses ambiguous language to confuse you? That is simply the fallacy of ambiguity, a deceptive way to make arguments seem more solid. It's like this example. Someone uses a word or phrase with multiple meanings in a way that obscures the true meaning of their argument. Basically, he is saying that it could mean this or that, as suits him. But using ambiguous language does not make an argument valid. Let's analyze this now. Imagine someone says the sign said you could park there, so I parked there. But, well, could mean acceptable or even fine. The sign could have meant there was a fine for parking. The person uses the ambiguity of well to justify their actions. Another example, someone argues, what we need is a more radical approach, but radical could mean extreme or fundamental. The person could be using the word to appeal to those wanting extreme change without alienating those wanting fundamental change. He is using ambiguity to appeal to different groups. Why is the ambiguity fallacy used? Sometimes it is completely involuntary. They may not realize they're using a word with multiple meanings. Other times, it is a deliberate attempt to deceive you. By using ambiguous language, they can make their arguments seem more convincing than it is. And sometimes it is a way to avoid committing to a position. The problem with the fallacy of ambiguity is that it undermines clear communication. It creates confusion and ambiguity, making it harder to understand a real argument. It can lead to false conclusions and misleading arguments. It avoids the need to be specific. So, how can you detect a fallacy of ambiguity? Look for arguments that use words or phrases with multiple meanings. Pay attention to arguments that seem to change the meaning of a word in the middle of a sentence. Ask yourself if the word is used consistently throughout the argument. If you detect a fallacy of ambiguity, point it out. Politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that you said there is no problem parking here, but no problem can mean acceptable or fine. We need to clarify what meaning you intended. Or, I understand that you want a radical approach, but radical can mean extreme or fundamental. We need to define what you mean. Don't let someone convince you with ambiguous language. By questioning the fallacies of ambiguity, you will be able to maintain clearer and more precise discussions. You will be able to focus on the real meaning of the words and prevent ambiguity from leading you to erroneous conclusions. Remember that words have specific meanings that should not be changed or hidden. By learning to identify and address the fallacies of ambiguity, you will be able to maintain more meaningful discussions and prevent misleading language from leading you to erroneous conclusions. You can contribute to creating more precise and accurate dialogue in which words are used clearly and consistently. Anecdotal fallacy. I know someone who, or, in my experience, we all use personal stories to illustrate our arguments, but sometimes relying too much on them can lead us down the wrong path. That's where the anecdotal fallacy comes in. It goes like this. Someone uses a personal experience or isolated example to refute statistics or general truths. In essence, they're saying, my story prevails over your data. But the fact that something happened to one person does not mean it applies to everyone. Let's analyze it. Let's imagine that someone says, vaccines are dangerous. My cousin's son got sick after being vaccinated. Now, although it is possible that someone has an adverse reaction to a vaccine, this single anecdote does not invalidate the overwhelming scientific evidence that vaccines are safe and effective. The person is using an isolated incident to argue against a widely accepted fact. Another example, someone claims, climate change is not real. We had a record winter. Although weather patterns may vary, this single anecdote does not refute long-term trends showing a warming planet. The person is using a short-term meteorological phenomenon to argue against long-term climate data. Why is the anecdotal fallacy used? Sometimes it is because personal stories are easier to remember and identify than statistics. We tend to give more weight to vivid examples, even if they are not representative. Other times, it is because people distrust large data sets or scientific studies. And sometimes it is a way to dismiss information that conflicts with their personal beliefs. The problem with the anecdotal fallacy is that it ignores the importance of representative data. It can lead to inaccurate conclusions and bad decisions. It prioritizes individual experiences over broader patterns and trends. So, how can you detect an anecdotal fallacy? Look for arguments that rely heavily on personal stories or isolated examples. Pay attention to arguments that dismiss statistics or general truths. Ask yourself if the anecdote represents the general population. If you detect an anecdotal fallacy, point it out. Politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that your cousin's son got sick, but that doesn't change the fact that vaccines are generally safe and effective. Or, I understand that you had a cold winter, but that does not refute the long-term trends that show global warming. Don't let anyone convince you with isolated stories. By questioning anecdotal fallacies, you will be able to maintain more informed and rational conversations. You will be able to focus on the real evidence and avoid being influenced by irrelevant experiences. Remember that personal stories are valuable, but they should not replace data and evidence. By learning to identify and address anecdotal fallacies, you will be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived with misleading examples. You can help create a more balanced and evidence-based dialogue, in which claims are supported by data and not only by anecdotes. Circumstantial ad hominem fallacy. You only say it because of your situation or you are biased by your background. Have you ever felt that your arguments are rejected because of who you are instead of what you say? That is the circumstantial ad hominem fallacy, a deceptive way to attack the person, not the argument. It is like that. Someone attacks your argument by pointing out your circumstances or background, implying that those circumstances invalidate your argument. In essence, they are saying, you are biased, so you are wrong, but your circumstances do not make your arguments automatically false. Let's analyze it. Imagine that a politician defends a tax cut. Someone using the circumstantial ad hominem could respond, of course you want a tax cut. You are a multimillionaire. Now, it is true that the politician's wealth may influence his opinions, but that does not automatically mean that his argument in favor of the tax cut is wrong. The argument should be evaluated on its merits, not just on the speaker's wealth. Another example, someone who defends stricter environmental regulations. Someone using the circumstantial ad hominem could respond, you only say that because you live in a rich neighborhood and don't care about jobs. Again, where someone lives can influence their opinions, but that does not automatically mean that their argument in favor of environmental regulations is wrong. The argument should be evaluated on its merits, not just on the speaker's location. Why is the circumstantial ad hominem used? Sometimes it is a way to avoid having to enter the real debate. By attacking the person's circumstances, you avoid addressing the issue at hand. Other times, it is a way to create distrust. By implying that the person is biased, they can make their argument seem less credible. And sometimes it is a way to close a conversation without any real effort. The problem with the circumstantial ad hominem is that it ignores the importance of evaluating arguments on their own merits. It can lead to discarding valid claims based on irrelevant circumstances. It creates a hostile environment for debate and prevents meaningful dialogue, avoids any real commitment to the point presented. So, how do you detect a circumstantial ad hominem? Look for arguments that attack the person's circumstances or background instead of their argument. Pay attention to arguments that imply bias based on irrelevant factors. Ask yourself if the person's circumstances are really relevant to the validity of their argument. If you detect a circumstantial ad hominem, point it out. Politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that my wealth may influence my opinions, but let's focus on the real arguments for and against tax cuts. Or, I understand that where I live may influence my opinions, but let's focus on the real arguments for and against environmental regulations. Don't let anyone convince you with irrelevant attacks on your circumstances. By questioning circumstantial ad hominem fallacies, you will be able to maintain more informed and focused debates. You will be able to prioritize evaluating arguments on their own merits and avoid being diverted by irrelevant attacks. Remember that your circumstances do not make your arguments automatically false. By learning to identify and address circumstantial ad hominem fallacies, you'll be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being diverted by erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more honest and focused dialogue in which arguments are evaluated on their merits and not on the irrelevant circumstances of the person who makes them. Fallacy of composition. If each part is good, then everything must be good too. Or, as these ingredients are tasty, the cake will be tasty. Sounds logical, right? But sometimes we make the mistake of assuming that the whole is just the sum of its parts. That is where the composition fallacy comes into play. It is like this. Someone assumes that as something is true for the parts, it must be true of the whole. Basically, it is saying that what is true for individual pieces must be true of the whole. But that is not always so. Let's analyze this. Imagine a sports team with many talented players. Someone could argue that this team has the best players in each position, so it must be the best team overall. But that is not always true. Teamwork, strategy, and chemistry are also important factors. Individual talent does not guarantee overall success. Another example. Someone claims that these individual bricks are strong, so a wall built with them must be strong. But the resistance of the wall also depends on how the bricks are placed and the quality of the mortar. The fact that the individual components are strong does not mean the entire structure is. Why do people fall for the fallacy of composition? Sometimes it is about simplifying complex systems. We tend to focus on individual components and ignore the interactions between them. Other times, it is a matter of illusion. We want to believe that good pieces will automatically lead to a good result. And sometimes it is a way to avoid considering the bigger picture. The problem with the fallacy of composition is that it ignores the importance of emerging properties. Systems are often more than just the sum of their parts. New properties can emerge from interactions between the components. This can lead to inaccurate predictions and poor decisions. So, how do you detect the fallacy of composition? Look for arguments that take for granted that the whole is simply the sum of its parts. Pay attention to arguments that ignore interactions between the components. Ask yourself if the properties of the whole are necessarily the same as those of the parts. If you detect a fallacy of composition, point it out politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that this team has talented players, but that does not guarantee that it is the best team overall. Teamwork is also important. Or, I understand that these bricks are resistant, but the wall's resistance also depends on how they are placed. Do not let anyone convince you with faulty assumptions. By questioning the fallacies of composition, you can have more accurate and informed discussions. You can focus on the big picture and avoid being deceived by simplistic reasoning. Remember, the whole is not always the sum of its parts. By learning to identify and address the fallacies of composition, you can make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived by faulty assumptions. You can help create a more nuanced and accurate understanding of systems in which interactions and emerging properties are taken into account. Fallacy of the continuum. Where do you draw a line? Or, everything is a slippery slope. Have you ever felt that someone is dismissing a valid argument by claiming that there is no clear border? That is the continuum fallacy, a deceptive way to reject a distinction by claiming that there is no clear dividing line. It is like this. Someone argues that, as there is no clear dividing line between two extremes, there is no real difference between them. Basically, they're saying that everything changes gradually, so there is no difference. But the absence of a clear border does not mean there is no significant distinction. Let's analyze this. Imagine someone who opposes speed limits. Someone who uses the fallacy of the continuum could say, where do you draw the line between safe and unsafe speeds? There is no clear dividing line, so establishing speed limits makes no sense. Now, it is true that there is no single speed that is definitely safe or unsafe, but that does not mean there is no difference between driving at 20 kilometers per hour and 100 kilometers per hour. There is a clear difference in risk, even if no clear border exists. Another example, someone who opposes raising minimum wage. Someone who uses the fallacy of the continuum could say, where do you draw the line between a living wage and poverty wage? Everything is a gradual change, so it makes no sense to raise the minimum wage. Once again, it is true that there is no single salary that definitively marks the line between living and poverty. But that does not mean that there is no difference between a minimum wage of $7 and one of $15. There is a clear difference in the standard of living, even if there is no clear border. Why is the continuum fallacy used? Sometimes it is a way to avoid addressing the real issue. By claiming that there is no clear distinction, you can avoid addressing the substance of the argument. Other times, it is a way to create uncertainty. By implying that there are no real differences, they can make it seem like there's no need to act. And sometimes it is a way to avoid taking a position. The problem with the continuum fallacy is that it ignores the importance of recognizing significant distinctions. It can lead to dismissing valid concerns and preventing necessary measures. It creates a false sense of equivalence and prevents meaningful dialogue. It avoids the need to consider the real differences. So, how do you detect a continuum fallacy? Look for arguments that dismiss distinctions by claiming there is no clear dividing line. Pay attention to arguments that ignore the possibility of significant differences. Ask yourself if the absence of a clear border means there is no real distinction. If you detect a continuum fallacy, point it out. With education, of course. Say something like, I understand that there is no single speed that is definitely safe, but that does not mean there is no difference between 20 miles per hour and 100 miles per hour. Let's focus on the relative risks. Or, I understand that there is no single salary that definitively marks the line between living and poverty, but that does not mean there is no difference between $7 and $15. Let's focus on relative standards of living. Don't let anyone convince you with irrelevant claims about the absence of clear limits. By questioning continuity fallacies, you will be able to have more focused and productive discussions. You can prioritize recognizing significant distinctions and avoid being deceived by irrelevant claims about gradual changes. Remember, the absence of a clear dividing line does not mean there is no significant distinction. By learning to identify and address continuity fallacies, you can make more informed decisions and avoid being misled by erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more nuanced and effective dialogue in which significant distinctions are recognized instead of being disregarded. Fallacy of definition. You're changing the definition, or that is not what that word really means. Have you ever felt that someone is arguing about the meaning of a word and not about the real issue? That is the fallacy of definition, a deceptive way to win an argument by redefining terms. It is like this. Someone argues that a statement is false simply because it does not fit their personal definition of a key term. Basically, they're saying that you are wrong because you are using an incorrect definition. But definitions can be subjective, and changing them does not change the underlying reality. Let's analyze this. Imagine someone arguing whether a certain action is brave. Someone who uses the deafness fallacy could say he was not brave because courage means not being afraid. Now, although that is one definition of courage, it is not the only one. Many people define courage as acting despite fear. The person uses their own definition to dismiss the other's claim. Another example, someone argues whether a certain policy is fair. Someone who uses the deafness fallacy could say, that is not fair because justice means everyone gets exactly the same. Again, that is a definition of justice, but not the only one. Many people define justice as everyone getting what they need. The person uses their own definition to dismiss the other's argument. Why is the deafness fallacy used? Sometimes it is a way to avoid addressing the real problem. By arguing about definitions, you avoid addressing the substance of the argument. Other times, it is a way to assert intellectual superiority by claiming your definition is the only correct one. They may feel superior, and it is sometimes a way to end any conversation without real effort. The problem with the definition fallacy is that it ignores considering different perspectives and definitions. It can lead to unproductive discussions and to unresolved conflicts. It creates a false sense of certainty and prevents meaningful dialogue. It avoids the need for considering the real problem. So, how do you detect a definition fallacy? Look for arguments that dismiss claims based on personal definitions of key terms. Pay attention to arguments that ignore other possible valid definitions. Ask yourself if the person's definition is the only one possible. If you detect a definition fallacy, point it out politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that you define courage as absence of fear, but many people define it as acting despite fear. Let's discuss the action itself, regardless of definition. Or, I understand that you define justice as everyone getting exactly the same, but many people define it as everyone getting what they need. Let's discuss the policy itself, regardless of definition. Don't let someone convince you with irrelevant arguments on definitions. By questioning deafness fallacies, you can have more productive, focused discussions. You can prioritize addressing the real problem and avoid being diverted by irrelevant arguments about semantics. Remember that definitions can be subjective and that changing them does not change reality. By learning to identify and address deafness fallacies, you can make better informed decisions and avoid being deceived by flawed reasoning. You can help create a more honest and focused dialogue in which problems are addressed directly, without deviating into semantic arguments. Appeal to the fallacy of stone. That's nonsense, or I refuse to believe it. Have you ever been dismissed without a second thought? That is the appeal to stone, a forceful way to reject an idea without any real reason. It is like that. Someone dismisses a claim as absurd or false without providing evidence or counterargument. In essence, he is saying, I don't like it, so it's wrong. But just because you don't like something does not mean it's false. Let's analyze it. Imagine someone presents scientific evidence that challenges a deep-rooted belief. Someone who uses the fallacy of stone could simply say, that's ridiculous. I don't believe it. It offers no evidence to the contrary, no logical reasoning, just a flat rejection. He treats his own disbelief as if it was a solid, immovable stone. Another example, someone proposes a new solution to a complex problem. Someone who resorts to the argument of the stone could respond, that's crazy. It will never work. Again, without explanation or reasoning, just an instinctive rejection. It acts as if their opinion is the only one that matters. Why do people use the argument of the stone? Sometimes it is a way of avoiding cognitive dissonance. When they are faced with information that challenges their worldview, they can reject it to maintain their existing beliefs. Other times, it is a way to avoid intellectual effort. By affirming that something is absurd, they can avoid having to understand it. And sometimes it is a way to affirm their dominance. By rejecting someone's ideas, they can feel superior. The problem with the appeal to the stone is that it prevents constructive dialogue. It ignores the importance of evidence in critical thought. It prevents us from considering different perspectives. It treats personal disbelief as a sufficient counterargument. So, how can you detect an appeal to the stone? Look for arguments that dismiss claims without providing reasoning. Pay attention to arguments that are based solely on personal opinions or disbelief. Ask yourself if the person is providing any evidence or counterargument. If you detect an appeal to the stone, point it out. With education, of course. Say something like, I understand that scientific evidence is difficult for you to accept, but simply rejecting it does not make it false. Let's analyze the evidence. Or, I understand that you think the solution is far-fetched, but let's analyze the reasoning behind it. Don't let anyone convince you with empty disqualifications. By questioning appeals to the stone, you will be able to maintain more informed and productive debates. You can focus on the real evidence and avoid being diverted by irrelevant opinions. Remember that disbelief is not an argument. By learning to identify and address appeals to the stone, you can make more informed decisions and avoid being diverted by flawed reasoning. You can help create a more open and reasonable dialogue in which claims are evaluated based on evidence, not just personal opinions. Fallacy of hasty generalization. Have you ever heard someone say, my grandfather smoked a pack a day and lived to be 90, so smoking can't be that bad? Or, I know a guy who won the lottery, so buying tickets is a sure way to get rich. This type of claim sounds convincing, but they often fall victim to a common reasoning error called a hasty generalization. It's like this. You're looking at a small piece of a puzzle and trying to guess what the complete picture is. You are drawing a general conclusion based on insufficient evidence. You are taking a small sample and applying it to a much larger group. Let's analyze it. Imagine you're visiting a new city and you see 3 people driving recklessly. You might think, wow, everyone in this city drives like maniacs. But that is a hasty generalization. You have only seen a few drivers, and you are assuming that they represent the entire city's population. Another example, someone might say, I tried a new restaurant and the food was horrible. Therefore, all the food in that restaurant is horrible. He has had a bad experience and is generalizing it to all of the food in the restaurant. Why do people make hasty generalizations? Sometimes it's for convenience. It is easier to make quick judgments based on limited information than collecting more data. Other times it is because of bias. We tend to remember information that confirms our previous beliefs and ignore information that contradicts them. The problem with hasty generalizations is that they can lead to inaccurate and unfair conclusions. They can reinforce stereotypes and prejudices. They can also lead to poor decisions. For example, if you make a hasty generalization about a product or service, you might miss a good opportunity. So, how can you detect a hasty generalization? Look for statements that use words like all, each, always, and never. These words often indicate that someone is making a broad generalization. Also, ask yourself whether the evidence is sufficient. Is the sample size large enough? Is it representative of the entire group? If you detect a hasty generalization, point it out with education, of course. Say something like, I understand your point of view, but I don't think we can generalize from just a few examples. Or, I think we need more evidence before we could draw a conclusion about everyone. Don't let someone convince you with weak evidence. By questioning hasty generalizations, you will be able to have more accurate and fair conversations. You will be able to focus on real evidence and avoid making sweeping statements. Remember that just because something is true for a few people does not mean it is true for everyone. By learning to identify and address hasty generalizations, you will be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived by faulty reasoning. You will be able to contribute to creating a more logical and reasonable dialogue, in which conclusions are based on solid evidence and not on hasty assumptions. The historian's fallacy. They should have known it. Have you ever judged historical figures using current criteria? That is the historian's fallacy, a deceptive way of ignoring the context of the past. It is like this. Someone judges past actions or decisions based on information only known later, ignoring the limited knowledge of the time. Basically, they're saying that people should have known what we know now. But the people of the past did not have the same information that we have today. Let's analyze it. Imagine someone criticizing a general from a past war for making a strategic mistake. That person could say, the general should have known that the enemy planned an ambush. But the general did not have the intelligence information that we have now. He made decisions based on the information available at the time. That person is committing the historian's fallacy by judging the general in retrospect. Another example, someone criticizes a scientist from the past for having incorrect beliefs. That person could say, the scientist should have known that their theory was wrong. But the scientist worked with the scientific knowledge of that time. He did not have access to the discoveries that we now have. The person is committing the historian's fallacy by judging the scientist in retrospect. Why is the historian's fallacy used? Sometimes it is a way to create a false sense of superiority. By judging the past with hindsight, they may seem more intelligent. Other times, it is a way to avoid having to understand the complexities of the past. By simplifying history, they can make it seem easier to understand. And sometimes it is a way to justify current beliefs by demonizing past actions. The problem with the historian's fallacy is that it distorts our understanding of the past. It can lead to unfair judgments and inaccurate interpretations. It creates a false sense of moral superiority and prevents us from learning from history. It avoids the need to consider the historical context. So, how can you detect the historian's fallacy? Look for arguments that judge past actions or decisions based on information only known later. Pay attention to arguments ignoring the limited knowledge of that time. Ask yourself if the person accounts for the historical context. If you detect the historian's fallacy, point it out, of course, with education. Say something like, I understand that the general strategy now seems wrong, but they made decisions based on the information available then. Or, I understand that the scientific theory now seems incorrect, but they worked with the scientific knowledge of that time. Do not let anyone convince you with unfair judgments based on the benefit of hindsight. By questioning the historian's fallacy, you will be able to maintain more accurate and documented debates about the past. You will be able to prioritize the understanding of the historical context and prevent current prejudices from diverting you. Remember that people in the past lacked access to the same information we have today. By learning to identify and address the historian's fallacy, the ignoratio elenchi fallacy, you're not even talking about the subject, or that has nothing to do with what I have said. Have you ever been in a conversation where someone seems to be discussing a different topic from the one you raised? That is ignoratio elenchi, also known as missing the point. A deceptive way to divert a discussion is like this. Someone presents an argument that may be valid in itself, but that does not really address the issue in question. In essence, they're saying, I am right, but about something completely different. However, being right about something unrelated does not invalidate the original argument. Let's analyze it. Imagine someone arguing for the need to improve public transport. Someone who uses ignoratio elenchi could respond, think about the jobs that would be created if more roads were built. Now, job creation is a valid argument, but it does not address the issue of public transport improvement. They are not understanding the subject. Another example, someone criticizes a politician for their position on environmental issues. Someone using ignoratio elenchi could respond, but that politician is a great family man. Once again, being a good person in the family sphere is a positive quality, but it does not address the environmental policies of the politician. They are discussing something irrelevant. Other times, it is a way to avoid addressing difficult issues. By discussing something else, the real problem is avoided. And sometimes it is a way to distract and confuse. By changing the subject, they can divert the conversation. The problem with ignoratio elenchi is that it prevents meaningful dialogue. It ignores addressing the real issue. It can lead to unproductive discussions and unresolved conflicts. It creates the illusion of debate while avoiding the core of the matter. So, how is ignoratio elenchi detected? Look for arguments that do not address the topic discussed. Pay attention to arguments that introduce irrelevant topics. Ask yourself if the person is really responding to the issue. If you detect ignoratio elenchi, point it out. With education, of course. Say something like, I understand that job creation is important, but that does not solve the need for better public transport. Or, I understand that the politician is a good person and father, but that has nothing to do with their environmental policies. Do not let yourself be convinced by irrelevant arguments. By questioning the ignoratio elenchi, you will be able to maintain more focused, productive debates. You will be able to prioritize the real issue and prevent yourself from being diverted with irrelevant issues. Remember that being right about something else does not invalidate the original argument. By learning to identify and address ignoratio elenchi, you will be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived by erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more focused, meaningful dialogue in which problems are addressed directly, without avoiding them. Fallacy of incomplete comparison. This is better, or this is faster. Have you felt that a comparison lacks information? That is an incomplete comparison fallacy. Omitting important details is a deceptive way to make something seem better than it is. It is like this. Someone makes a comparison without specifying what exactly is being compared or what is the standard of comparison. Basically, it is saying that this is better without saying better than what or better in what sense. Let's analyze this. Imagine an advertisement that says, our phone has faster processor. Sounds great, but faster than what is? Faster than last year's Model S? Faster than the competition's phone is? Faster to run games or to browse. Without specifying the comparison, the claim is senseless. Another example, someone claims, this car uses less fuel. Again, that sounds good. But does it use less fuel than what? Does it use less fuel than a van, than an average car, in the city or on road? Without specifying the comparison, the claim seems misleading. Why are incomplete comparisons often used? Sometimes it is a way to create a false superiority. By making vague claims, they can make their product or idea seem better than it actually is. Other times, it is a way to avoid providing evidence. By omitting details, they can avoid having to be accountable for their claims. And sometimes it is a way to take advantage of our tendency to assume positive comparisons. The problem with incomplete comparisons is they mislead. They can lead to bad decisions based on information. They create a false sense of superiority and prevent comparisons. They avoid the need to provide the necessary information. So, how do you detect an incomplete comparison now? Look for arguments that make comparisons without specifying what is compared. Pay attention to arguments that omit details. Ask yourself if the comparison is clear and complete now. If you detect an incomplete comparison, point this out. Politely, of course, say something like, "You say your phone has a faster processor, but faster than what?" Can you further specify the comparison? Or say, "You say this car consumes less fuel, but less than what?" Can you provide some more details? Do not let anyone convince you with misleading comparisons. By questioning incomplete comparisons, you will be able to maintain more informed and accurate discussions. You can prioritize understanding the full context of a comparison and avoid being misled by incomplete information. Remember that a comparison only makes sense when clear and complete. By learning to identify and address incomplete comparisons, you can make informed decisions and avoid being misled by erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more honest and transparent dialogue in which all necessary information for comparisons is made. Music, the fallacy of the loaded questions. Have you ever been asked a question that seems like a trap, no matter how you answer? For example, have you stopped hitting your wife? Even if you have never hit anyone ever. That is a classic example of loaded question. It is a deceptive way of insinuating something without really stating it. It goes like this. Someone asks a question containing an assumption, and that assumption is harmful or deceptive. Basically, they are saying, answer this question and admit something you have not done. But the fact of answering the question does not mean that you agree with the assumption. Let's analyze this. Imagine someone asks you, why are politicians so corrupt? This question presumes that all politicians are corrupt, but that is not always true. There are honest and also corrupt politicians. By formulating the question this way, the person tries to insinuate that corruption is widespread. Another example. When will you stop wasting taxpayers' money on useless projects? This question presumes the projects are useless, but that is a matter of opinion. The projects may be valuable to some people. By formulating the question this way, the person tries to insinuate the projects are a waste. Why are loaded questions used? Sometimes it is a way to manipulate a conversation. By inserting an assumption, they can control the narrative. Other times, it is a way to damage someone's reputation. By insinuating something negative, they can make someone look bad. And sometimes it is just a way to express an opinion without having to provide evidence. The problem with loaded questions is they force the interviewee to be defensive. They must deny the assumption, which can make them look guilty, or accept it, damaging their credibility. It puts you in a lose-lose situation. So, how do you detect loaded questions? Look for questions containing hidden assumptions. Pay attention to questions using loaded language or emotional terms. Ask yourself if the question is fair and unbiased. If you detect a loaded question, point it out politely, of course. Say something like, I'm not going to answer that question because it presumes all politicians are corrupt, and I do not believe that. Or, I'm not going to answer that question because it presumes the projects are useless, and that is a matter of opinion. Do not let them trap you with such questions. By questioning loaded questions, you will maintain more sincere and productive conversations. You will avoid being forced to adopt a defensive position, and you will be able to focus on real issues. Remember, just because someone asks a question does not mean you must answer it. By learning to identify and address loaded questions, you will be able to have more meaningful discussions and avoid being deceived by deceptive tactics. You can help create a fairer and more balanced dialogue where assumptions are questioned rather than accepted. Logic fallacy. Life is a game, right? You just have to calculate all probabilities. Have you ever tried to apply the perfect rules of a game to the chaotic reality of life? That is the ludic fallacy, a deceptive way of thinking that we can predict what is unpredictable. It goes like this. Someone assumes that since something can be measured or modeled in a game or simplified system, it can be understood and perfectly predicted in the real world. Basically, they're saying that if it works in game, it works in life. But life is not a game. Let's analyze this. Imagine someone uses complex mathematical models to predict the stock market. Now, mathematical models can be useful tools, but the stock market is influenced by countless unpredictable factors like human emotions, political events, and random news. The model cannot account for everything. The person commits the ludic fallacy by thinking the model is perfect. Another example, someone trying to predict the result of a war using only game theory. Now, game theory can offer information, but war is chaotic and unpredictable. It implies human error, unforeseen events, and the fog of war. The person commits the ludic fallacy when they think that they can predict the result perfectly. Why do people use the ludic fallacy? Sometimes it is a way to create a false sense of control. When applying rigid models, they feel that they understand and can control the unpredictable. Other times, it is a way to avoid dealing with uncertainty. By pretending that life is a game, they ignore chaotic reality. And sometimes it is a way to simplify complex issues, making them easier to solve. The problem with the ludic fallacy is that it ignores the importance of unpredictability. It can lead to bad decisions based on unrealistic expectations. It creates a false sense of security and prevents us from preparing for the unexpected. It avoids the need to consider the complexity of the real world. So, how can the ludic fallacy be detected? Look for arguments assuming that real-world situations can be perfectly modeled as games. Pay attention to arguments ignoring unpredictable factors. Ask yourself if the model or game really reflects the situation's complexity. If you detect the ludic fallacy, point it out with education, of course. Say something like, I understand that the mathematical model is useful, but it cannot explain all the unpredictable factors in the stock market. Or, I understand that game theory offers valuable information, but war is far more chaotic and unpredictable. Do not let anyone convince you with unrealistic predictions based on simplified models. By questioning the ludic fallacy, you will maintain more realistic and grounded debates. You will prioritize understanding the limits of the models and prevent them from deceiving you with false certainties. Remember that life isn't a game. By learning to identify and address the ludic fallacy, you will make more informed decisions and prevent it from deceiving you with erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more realistic and adaptable dialogue in which the complexity of real-world situations is recognized. Fallacy of the golden mean. Let's stay in the middle ground, or there's truth on both sides. Sounds reasonable, right? But sometimes settling on the middle ground is not the best solution. That is where the middle ground fallacy comes into play. It is like this. Someone argues that a compromise between two extremes is always the correct answer. In essence, they're saying that the truth must lie at some intermediate point. But just because something is in the middle does not mean that it is correct. Let's analyze this. Let's imagine a debate about whether Earth is flat or round. Someone argues that Earth is flat, and another argues that it is a perfect sphere. Someone using the middle ground fallacy could say that Earth must be a flat circle. But that's not true. The Earth is an oblate spheroid. The middle ground isn't always the correct answer. Another example, a politician proposes a 50% tax reduction, and another proposes a 50% tax increase. Someone using the middle ground fallacy could say, let's keep taxes as they are, but that may not be the optimal solution. The correct answer depends on the specific economic situation. The middle ground is not always the best solution. Why is the middle ground fallacy used? Sometimes it is a way to avoid conflict. When suggesting a compromise, you can give the impression of being reasonable. Other times, it is a way of simplifying complex issues. By assuming that the middle ground is always correct, you avoid having to investigate yourself. And sometimes it is a way to seem neutral or impartial. The problem with the fallacy of the middle ground is that it ignores the importance of critical thought and evidence. The fact that something is in the middle does not necessarily mean that it is the best option. It can lead to poor decisions and suboptimal results. It assumes that both extremes are equally valid, which often isn't the case. So, how do you detect a fallacy of the middle ground? Look for arguments that automatically assume compromise is the right answer. Pay attention to arguments that avoid discussing the merits on each side. Ask yourself if the middle ground is truly supported by evidence. If you detect a fallacy of the middle ground, point this out. With education, of course. Say something like, I understand that you suggest a compromise, but I don't think the middle ground is necessarily the best solution here. Or, I understand that you're trying to be neutral, but I think we should consider the evidence from either side. Don't let anyone convince you with empty compromises. By questioning the fallacies of the middle ground, you will be able to maintain more rational and informed conversations. You will be able to focus on the real evidence and avoid being swayed by irrelevant compromises. Remember, the middle ground is not always the correct answer. By learning to identify and address the fallacies of the middle ground, you will be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived by false compromises. You can help create a more nuanced and evidence-based dialogue, in which solutions are based on facts, not just on compromises. Moralistic fallacy. If it seems right, it must be true. Or good people simply know this is true. Have you ever heard these types of statements? They try to blur the line between what is and what should be. And that is the moralistic fallacy. It is a deceptive way of misrepresenting facts to fit our ideals. It is like this: someone assumes that since something should be a certain way, it is that way. In essence, they're saying, the world works how I want. But our desires do not change reality. Let's analyze this. Imagine someone says, everyone should be kind, so there is no real evil. Now, kindness is a great ideal, but that does not erase the existence of harmful intentions and actions. That person is letting their moral desires dictate their understanding about reality. Another example. Someone argues that the world should be fair so that everyone has the same opportunities to succeed, regardless of their origin. Although we must fight for justice, pretending that we all start from the same basis ignores the inequalities in the real world. That person is letting their moral beliefs distort their perception of facts. Why is the moralistic fallacy used? Sometimes it is a way to avoid facing uncomfortable truths. By insisting that the world conforms to their ideals, they avoid dealing with difficult realities. Other times, it is a way of justifying one's own actions. By claiming that their actions are morally correct, criticism can then be dismissed. Criticism. And sometimes it is simply a way to express strong emotional beliefs as if they were facts. The problem with the moralistic fallacy is that it clouds our judgment. It can lead to unrealistic expectations and harmful decisions. It prevents us from addressing real-world problems because we pretend they do not exist. It ignores the difference between how we wish things were and how they truly are. Then, how can a moralistic fallacy be detected? Look for arguments blurring the line between what is and should be. Pay attention to arguments ignoring evidence contradicting their moral beliefs. Ask yourself if the person confuses their desires with reality. If you detect a moralistic fallacy, point it out politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that goodness is important, but that does not mean that evil does not exist. We must recognize harmful actions. Or, I understand that we must fight for justice, but pretending that we all have the same opportunities ignores the inequalities of the real world. Do not let anyone convince you with illusions. By questioning moralistic fallacies, you can have more realistic and productive discussions. You can focus on the real facts and avoid being deceived by emotional desires. Remember that our ideals do not change reality. By learning to identify and address moralistic fallacies, you can make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived by erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more honest and realistic dialogue in which facts are recognized instead of ignoring them. Appealing to tradition. We have always done it this way, or it has always been this way. Have you ever felt that tradition is used to justify something without any real reason? That is appealing to tradition. A deceptive way of claiming that something is correct simply because it is old. It is like that. Someone argues that a practice or belief is valid simply because it has existed for a long time. Basically, they're saying that it is good because it is old. But the fact that something is traditional does not automatically mean that it is correct or effective. Let's analyze it. Let's imagine that someone opposes marriage between people of the same sex. Someone who resorts to appealing to tradition could say, marriage has always been between a man and a woman, so it must continue to be so. Now, it is true that historically, traditional marriage has been between a man and a woman. But that does not mean that it is the only valid form of marriage. Traditions can change and society evolves. Another example, someone opposes the use of new technologies in schools. Someone who resorts to tradition could say, we have always taught students with textbooks, so we must continue to do so. Once again, textbooks have been a traditional teaching tool, but that does not mean that they are the most effective tool in today's world. Technology can offer new and valuable learning opportunities. Why is tradition resorted to? Sometimes it is a way to avoid change. By clinging to tradition, you avoid having to adapt to new circumstances. Other times, it is a way to create a sense of comfort and security. By relying on familiar practices, you can feel more stability. And sometimes it is a way to assert authority. By claiming that something is traditional, they can make it seem more legitimate. The problem with appealing to tradition is that it ignores the importance of progress and innovation. It can lead to clinging to obsolete practices and beliefs. It can prevent us from adapting to new challenges and opportunities. It avoids the need to consider whether something is still useful. So, how can appealing to tradition be detected? Look for arguments claiming that something is valid simply because it is traditional. Pay attention to arguments that ignore the need for progress and change. Ask yourself if the tradition is still relevant and effective. If you detect an appeal to tradition, point it out. Politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that marriage has traditionally been between a man and a woman, but that does not mean that marriage between people of the same sex is invalid. Traditions can change. Or, I understand that traditionally we have used textbooks, but let's consider the possible benefits of technology in schools. Do not let anyone convince you with empty appeals to tradition. By questioning appeals to tradition, you will be able to maintain more informed and progressive debates. You will be able to prioritize the evaluation of practices and beliefs based on their merits, and not only on their antiquity. Remember that just because something is traditional does not automatically make it correct or effective. By learning to identify and address appeals to tradition, you'll be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived with erroneous reasoning. It can help create a more progressive and adaptable dialogue in which practices are evaluated based on their current value, not only on their historical presence. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Do you see it? I told you. Or that proves my point. Have you ever seen someone select data to fit their narrative? That is the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, a deceptive way to create patterns where there are none. It is like this. Someone selects data that supports their claim and ignores data that does not. In essence, they're saying, look at this pattern that I have found, but they have conveniently ignored all the data that does not fit. Let's analyze it. Imagine someone drawing a target on the wall of a barn after shooting a bunch of arrows. Then they point to the group of arrows and say, look how accurate I am, but they have ignored all the arrows that have not hit the barn. They are creating a pattern a posteriori. Another example, someone claims that this city is unlucky. Look at all the traffic accidents that have occurred on this street. But they have ignored all the other streets of the town where there have also been accidents. They focus on a specific area to create a false sense of pattern. Why is the Texas sharpshooter fallacy used? Sometimes it is unintentional. You may be trying to find patterns in the data sincerely, but without being objective. Other times, it is a deliberate attempt to deceive. By selecting the data, you can make the claim seem more convincing. And sometimes, it is a way to confirm your existing prejudices. The problem with the Texas sharpshooter fallacy is that it ignores the importance of representative data. It can lead to inaccurate conclusions and misleading claims. It creates the illusion of patterns where there are none. It avoids the need to consider all the evidence. So, how do you detect the Texas sharpshooter fallacy? Look for arguments that selectively use data to support a claim. Pay attention to arguments that ignore data that contradicts the claim. Ask yourself if the person is taking into account all the relevant data. If you detect a Texas sharpshooter fallacy, point it out. Politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that there have been accidents on that street, but we must take into account all the streets of the city to get a complete picture. Or, I understand that you focus on that group of arrows, but we must take into account all the arrows to evaluate your accuracy. Do not let anyone convince you with selective data. By questioning Texas sharpshooter fallacies, you will be able to maintain more accurate and objective debates. You will be able to focus on the real evidence and avoid being deceived by misleading patterns. Remember that data must be considered in its entirety. By learning to identify and address Texas sharpshooter fallacies, you'll be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived with erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more honest and objective dialogue in which claims are supported by representative data and not only by selected points. Fallacy of selective selection. Look at all of the evidence that proves my argument. Or do these examples show exactly what I mean? Have you ever felt that someone only shows you evidence that supports their claim and hides the rest? That is selecting data, a deceptive way to make weak arguments seem strong. It is like this. Someone selects only data or examples that support their argument and ignores any evidence that contradicts it. Basically, they're saying, look at this perfect image, but they have hidden all the pieces that do not fit. Let's analyze it. Imagine that someone argues that a certain diet is incredibly effective. They could show you testimonials from people who have lost weight with the diet and studies that seem to support it, but ignore studies that show that the diet is ineffective or even harmful. They are selecting evidence to make their argument seem more solid. Another example. Someone argues that a certain policy is effective. They could show you statistics that seem to support their claim and stories of people who have benefited from the policy. But they could ignore statistics that show that the policy has negative consequences or stories of people who have been harmed by it. They are selecting evidence to defend their position. Why is evidence selected? Sometimes it is unintentional. It may be people who are really trying to find evidence to support their beliefs, but are not objective. Other times, it is a deliberate attempt to deceive. By selectively selecting evidence, they can make their claims seem more convincing, and sometimes it is a way to reinforce their existing prejudices. Find evidence that confirms their beliefs. The problem with selective selection is that it ignores the importance of considering all evidence. It can lead to inaccurate conclusions and misleading claims. It creates a false sense of certainty and prevents meaningful understanding. It avoids the need to consider the amount of contrary evidence. So, how do you detect selective selection? Look for arguments that selectively use evidence to support a claim. Pay attention to arguments that ignore evidence contradicting the claim. Ask yourself if the person is taking into account all relevant evidence. If you detect selective selection, point it out politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that you have shown me examples of people who have lost weight with the diet, but are there studies that show that it is ineffective or harmful? Or, I understand that you have shown me statistics that support the policy, but are there statistics that show it has negative consequences? Do not let anyone convince you with selective evidence. By questioning selective selection, you will be able to maintain more accurate and documented debates. You can prioritize considering all evidence and avoid being deceived by misleading claims. Remember that evidence must be considered in its entirety. By learning to identify and address bias selection, you will be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived by erroneous reasoning. You can help create a more honest and objective dialogue in which claims are supported by all relevant evidence, not just a selected few. Fallacy of the burden of proof. Prove to me that I am wrong, or it is up to you to prove to me that it is not true. Have you ever heard these types of claims? They sound safe, but they can hide a logical evasion called the fallacy of the burden of proof. It is like this. Someone makes a claim and, instead of providing evidence to support it, shifts the responsibility to the other person to refute it. Basically, they are saying that it is true until proven otherwise. But logic does not work that way. The person making the claim has the burden of proof. Let's analyze it. Imagine that someone says, there is a teapot orbiting the sun between Earth and Mars. You could ask, how do you know that? He could answer, prove to me that it is false. But demonstrating a negation is impossible. You cannot demonstrate that something doesn't exist. The person making the affirmation has the responsibility to provide evidence. Another example, someone claims that a new supplement cures all illnesses. You could ask, what evidence do you have? He could answer, prove to me that it is false. But, again, the burden of proof falls on him, who is the one who must provide evidence that it works. Why is the burden of proof fallacy used? Sometimes it is a way to avoid providing evidence. When someone's affirmation is weak, they may shift responsibility to the other person. Other times, it is a way to create a false sense of certainty. By demanding evidence of the negative, they make their affirmation seem more credible. And sometimes it is a way to close a conversation and avoid any debate. The problem with the burden of proof fallacy is that it ignores the fundamental principles of logic. The person who makes the affirmation has a responsibility to provide evidence. It is not the other person's responsibility to refute it. This can lead to accepting affirmations without any basis. So, how is the burden of proof fallacy detected? Look for arguments that transfer the responsibility of refuting an affirmation. Pay attention to arguments that use phrases like, prove to me that I am wrong, or it's up to you to prove it to me. Ask yourself if the person making the affirmation is providing any evidence to support it. If you detect the burden of proof fallacy, point it out. In a polite way, of course. Say something like, I understand that you believe that there is a teapot orbiting the sun, but the burden of proof falls on you, who must provide evidence, and not on me, who does not have to refute it. Or, I understand that you believe that this supplement cures all illnesses, but I would like to see some evidence to support that claim. Do not let anyone convince you with empty affirmations. By questioning the burden of proof fallacies, you will be able to maintain more logical and substantiated conversations. You can focus on the real evidence and avoid being influenced by irrelevant demands. Remember, the burden of proof is on the person who makes the affirmation. By learning to identify and address the burden of proof fallacies, you will be able to make more informed decisions and avoid being deceived with unfounded affirmations. You can help create a more logical and evidence-based dialogue in which affirmations are supported by facts and not only by the transfer of responsibilities. Fallacy of personal incredulity. I cannot believe it, so it must be false. Or, that is too complicated. It cannot be true. Have you ever surprised yourself or another person saying things like this? That is when personal incredulity sneaks in, a deceptive way to dismiss something just because you do not understand it. It is like this. Someone rejects an affirmation simply because it is hard for them to believe or understand. In essence, they are saying, I do not understand it, so it is not real. But the fact that you do not understand something does not mean it is false. Let us analyze it. Imagine that someone says, I do not understand how evolution works, so it must be wrong. Now, evolution is a complex process, but that does not mean it is not true. Scientific theories often involve intricate concepts that require time and effort to understand. The person is letting their lack of understanding dictate their belief. Another example, someone argues, the universe is too vast to have arisen by chance, so there must be a creator. While it is true that the universe is vast, that does not automatically prove a creator's existence. Scientific theories offer explanations for the formation of the universe, even if they are hard to fully understand. The person is letting their personal sense of wonder and confusion replace objective analysis. Why do people use personal incredulity? Sometimes it is a way to avoid cognitive dissonance. When faced with information that challenges their vision of the world, they can reject it to maintain their existing beliefs. Other times, it is a way to avoid intellectual effort. By claiming that something is incredible, they avoid having to learn it. And sometimes it is a way to express feelings of being overwhelmed in the face of complex information. The problem with personal incredulity is that it ignores evidence and critical thinking. The fact that you don't understand something doesn't mean that it isn't true. It can lead to discarding valid claims based on personal limits. It creates a barrier to understanding and learning. So, how can you detect personal incredulity? Look for arguments that reject claims simply because they are hard to believe. Pay attention to the arguments that ignore the evidence and are based on personal feelings of disbelief. Ask yourself if the person's lack of understanding is reason to dismiss the claim. If you detect personal incredulity, point it out politely, of course. Say something like, "I understand that evolution is complex, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. Let's look at the scientific evidence." Or, "I understand that the universe is vast, but that doesn't prove there's a creator. Let's explore the scientific theories." Don't let someone convince you with personal incredulity. By questioning personal incredulity, you can have more objective and informed discussions. You can focus on real evidence and avoid being diverted by personal limitations. Remember that your understanding does not determine reality when learning to address personal incredulity. You can make more informed decisions and avoid being diverted by faulty reasoning. You can help create a more open and curious dialogue in which claims are evaluated based on evidence, not only on personal feelings of incredulity, which in Latin means fallacy, but you do it too. Have you ever caught yourself or someone else using this phrase in a discussion? It sounds like a quick answer, but it often hides a logical trap called tu quoque, which in Latin means you too. It is a way to deflect criticism by pointing out the hypocrisy of the arguer. It is like that. Someone accuses you of doing something wrong, and instead of addressing the accusation, you say, "But you do it too." Basically, you are saying, your argument is invalid because you are also guilty. But the fact that someone is a hypocrite does not mean their argument is incorrect. Let's analyze it. Imagine someone criticizing you for eating unhealthy food. You could respond, "But you eat junk food all the time." Now, their eating habits may be relevant to a discussion about healthy lifestyles, but they do not invalidate criticism of your diet. You are deflecting criticism instead of addressing it. Another example. A politician criticizes their opponent for accepting donations from interest groups. The opponent responds, "But you also accept donations from interest groups." Once again, both politicians could be guilty of the same practice. But that doesn't mean that the original criticism is invalid. It just means that both parties may have to change their practices. Why is the tu quoque used? Sometimes it is a way to avoid taking responsibility for one's actions. When someone is caught doing something wrong, they may try to deflect blame by pointing out the hypocrisy of others. Other times, it is a way to silence criticism. By making the accuser look hypocritical, they can undermine their credibility. And sometimes it is an instinctive reaction to feeling attacked. The problem with quoting is that it ignores the real problem that arises. It creates a false equivalence between accuser and the accused. It prevents productive debates and hinders conflict resolution. It is a way of saying that if you're not perfect, you cannot criticize me. So, how is a you too fallacy detected? Look for arguments that divert criticism by pointing out the accuser's hypocrisy. Pay attention to arguments that avoid addressing the real issue. Ask yourself if the accuser's actions are relevant to the validity of their argument. If you detect a you too fallacy, point it out politely, of course. Say something like, "I understand that you also eat junk food, but that does not change the fact that my diet could be healthier." Or, "I understand that you also accept donations from special interest groups, but that does not invalidate criticisms of my own donations." Don't let anyone distract you from the real issue. By challenging fallacies, you can have more honest and productive conversations. You can focus on the real issue and prevent yourself from being diverted by irrelevant accusations. Remember that just because someone is a hypocrite does not mean their argument is incorrect. By learning to identify and address fallacies, you can have more meaningful discussions and avoid being deceived by deceptive tactics. You can help create a more focused and productive dialogue in which real problems are addressed, rather than deviating from them. Psychologist's fallacy. You're only projecting your own feelings or analyzing me, not the problem. Have you ever felt that someone is trying to dismiss your opinions by claiming that you have a psychological problem? That is the psychologist's fallacy, a deceptive way to dismiss arguments by claiming they are just psychological projections. It is like that. Someone assumes that since a person's beliefs or arguments may be influenced by psychological factors, they must be invalid. In essence, they are saying, you only say it because you feel that way. But psychological influences do not automatically make an argument false. Let's analyze it. Imagine someone advocating stricter gun control. Someone using the psychologist fallacy might respond, you only say that because you are afraid of guns. Now, that person's fear of guns may influence their opinions, but that does not mean that their argument in favor of gun control is invalid. The argument should be evaluated on its merits, not just on the possible psychological motivations of the person making it. Another example, someone criticizes the policies of a politician, and someone using the psychologist fallacy might respond, you are just projecting your own insecurities onto the politician. Again, the critic's insecurities may influence their opinions, but that does not mean that their criticisms of the policies are invalid. The criticisms should be evaluated on their merits, not just on the possible psychological motivations of the critic. Why is the psychologist fallacy used? Sometimes it is a way to avoid having to face the real argument. By claiming that the person is only projecting their feelings, they can avoid addressing the issue at hand. Other times, it is a way to create distrust. By implying that the person has a psychological defect, they can make their argument seem less credible, and sometimes it is a way to close a conversation without any real effort. The problem of the psychologist fallacy is that it ignores the importance of evaluating arguments on their own merits. It can lead to dismissing valid claims based on irrelevant psychological motivations. It creates a hostile environment for debate and prevents meaningful dialogue. It avoids any real engagement with the point presented. So, how is a psychologist fallacy detected? Look for arguments that dismiss claims by alleging they are just psychological projections. Pay attention to arguments that ignore the actual content of the claim. Ask yourself if the person's psychological motivations are really relevant to the validity of their argument. If you detect a psychologist fallacy, point it out. Politely, of course, say something like, I understand that my fear of guns may influence my opinion, but let's focus on the real arguments for and against gun control. Or, I understand that my insecurities may influence my criticisms, but let's focus on the real criticisms of politicians' policies. Do not let anyone convince you with irrelevant claims of psychological projection. When questioning the psychological fallacies, you will be able to maintain more informed and focused debates. You will be able to give priority to the evaluation of the arguments for their own merits and avoid that irrelevant attacks on psychological motivations divert you. Remember that psychological influences do not automatically make an argument false. When learning to identify and address the psychological fallacies, you will be able to make more informed decisions and avoid that erroneous reasonings divert you. You can help to create a more honest and focused dialogue in which the arguments are evaluated based on their merits and not on the irrelevant psychological motivations of the person who exposes them. Fallacy of argument theft. Have you been in a conversation where someone suddenly changed the subject just as you were about to say something interesting? Or maybe you have seen a debate where politicians seem to talk about completely different things. That is a classic example of the argument theft fallacy. It is like this. Someone introduces a distraction in the conversation, like a red herring, to divert attention from the real subject. Basically, they are saying, look here, do not worry about what we were talking about. But the fact that they changed the subject does not mean the original subject disappeared. Let's analyze this. Imagine that you are discussing about the need for a more strict control of the weapons. Someone could respond, but what about the mental health crisis? We have to address that too. Now, mental health is a serious subject, but it is not the same as weapons control. They are introducing a smokescreen into the conversation to distract attention from the original subject. Another example, you're talking about the high cost of university tuition. Someone could respond, well, today's students are so lazy that they spend all their time on social networks. Once again, the behavior of the students can be a valid subject, but it does not address the question of the cost of the tuition. They are changing the subject to avoid the real debate. Why are smokescreens used? Sometimes it is a way to avoid answering a difficult question. When someone's argument is weak, they can try changing the subject to avoid being questioned. Other times, it is a way to manipulate the conversation. When introducing a new subject, they can control the discussion's direction, and sometimes it is simply a way to confuse or distract the other person. The problem with the fallacy of argument theft is that it prevents productive discussions from occurring. It diverts attention from the real subjects and makes reaching a solution difficult. It creates a smokescreen. So, how is the argument theft fallacy detected? Look for arguments that introduce irrelevant subjects. Pay attention to arguments that seem to change the subject abruptly. Ask yourself if the new subject is really related to the original one. If you detect a red herring fallacy, point it out politely, of course. Say something like, "I understand that mental health is important, but I would like to focus on the subject of weapons control." Or, "Well, I understand that the behavior of the students is a reason for concern, but that does not address the subject of the costs of the tuition." Do not let anyone distract you from the real subject. When questioning the fallacies of distraction, you'll be able to maintain more focused and productive conversations. You will be able to stay on the subject and avoid irrelevant arguments diverting you. Remember that the fact someone changes the subject does not mean the original subject disappeared. When learning to identify and address the fallacies of the smokescreen, you'll be able to maintain more significant debates and avoid being deceived with deceptive tactics. You'll be able to contribute to creating a more focused and productive dialogue in which the real subjects are addressed instead of avoiding them.